This week, it's time to learn about resource logs, and we're going to play more with service endpoints as well as IAM policies. Way back in our early labs, we learned about the importance of management plane logging, and we implemented CloudTrail throughout our entire AWS organization. But these are only one source of logs, and I like to break things down into a few broad categories to know which logs you should be collecting. At the start, we've got those management plane logs, which is the logs of all the providers' API calls, or, well, most of the API calls. We're not going to talk about those undocumented ones. And in AWS, this is done with CloudTrail, and we got that all set up already. Next are service logs, and these are logs produced by a service when you enable it. Now, although CloudTrail grabs all the main API calls, sometimes other services produce separate logs. Think about what we were doing with guard duty. If you save those into S3, that's a service log that's associated with that service, but not necessarily an individual resource. Which brings us to resource logs. These are logs from individual resources like an EC2 instance or an S3 bucket. Now, to be totally honest, these do sometimes overlap with service logs, but not always. Here's a easy way to think about it. When I make API calls in AWS, those are recorded in the management plane log. For some services, when I turn them on, they keep their own logs, and those might be stored in different places like Amazon S3 or Amazon CloudWatch. Then, individual resources like an EC2 instance, a container, an S3 bucket, or even an entire VPC with its own something called flow logs, or a Lambda function, those can all also create their own logs. So in AWS, we have this weird situation where some types of activity we want to track happens via the API calls, and we're going to get those with CloudTrail. But in other situations, it's not going to be considered a management event, which is what shows up in CloudTrail logs by default, the way we have things set up. Amazon calls these data events, and they're for resources like S3 buckets or even Lambda functions where there might be a really high volume, and Amazon doesn't want to keep the darn things unless somebody else is paying more for them. We're not going to talk about those today. We will get into those once we get into data security and maybe when we get into Lambda functions. So to me, these are resource logs. They just happen to be collected by CloudTrail and as opposed to a different mechanism, and you still need to turn them on. Now, as security, do I need all the logs? Probably not. I mean, some of these are useful in an investigation, but many of these are operational and don't affect us on a day-to-day basis. Storing logs is stupid expensive even in cloud, and we need to pick and choose. We're going to focus today on workload logs, and workload is the term we use for the places where our code and apps run. It's instances, containers, and Lambda functions mostly. And for workload logs, the main thing I want to collect is the user activity, like when somebody logs in and what they actually do. As previously mentioned, Session Manager has a capability to store logs into S3 or CloudWatch logs, and it will record every command you type into the console, unless you get fancy with some SSH tunneling, and I'm not going to get into that. This is pretty awesome because we can now, with Session Manager, restrict who can log into which instances using IAM and getting fancy with things like IAM tags. We know that because we enforce MFA when somebody logs in through IAM Identity Center. Remember, we turn MFA on for everybody. This also means that their terminal sessions are also protected with MFA because they can't get into Session Manager without it. Session Manager tracks all the sessions and attributes them back to the user who logged in. And in our case, because we're doing all this through IAM Identity Center, we know the actual human being on the other side. And if we enable it, and we're going to enable it today, Session Manager will log every command somebody types in during a session. You can even trigger notifications and events based on specific activity when you log these sessions. Okay, so a few caveats. First is this only logs the command you type in during a session. If there's other things going on a system, you're not going to get that. And if you want system logs, which is all the internal logs of a server, of an instance, or a container, you need to use a different tool like the CloudWatch Logs agent, which saves those to CloudWatch, or a commercial tool that'll send it off to your SIM or whatever log correlation platform you're using. Another caveat is that logs store everything you type. And if that includes passwords, you should use the special command line in the documentation that I linked to in the blog post. That's going to make sure that you're not actually going to be seeing things like passwords stored in your logs, which is going to be a little bit risky. And finally, if you log in or if you allow someone to log in outside of Session Manager or somebody hacks in, that activity is not going to be logged. This is only going to log activity that goes through the Session Manager agent. And you do need to know that the logs are written out by that agent in that instance, not by the session manager service itself. And this is a good thing because we don't want the Amazon service looking at all of our command lines unencrypted. So they do it at the agent level, and the agent connects directly to S3, and that's how it stores the logs. And as we get into the lab, you'll see we have to do some little IAM permissions to get all of that set up. Okay, so that's it for the overview for today. Really quick, we're now going to go ahead and get started with the lab. We're going to be doing a lot in this lab. It's going to go pretty quickly because I try to do most of the hard work for you in your CloudFormation template. So we're going to start by running another CloudFormation template. It's basically the exact same one as last week with a couple of small additions. The first is that I added a service endpoint for S3. Why? Because that SSM agent, the session manager agent in our instances, needs to be able to save its logs to S3. It has no way to do that. And I actually learned that the hard way. You can go read the blog post to find out about that. And so we need to have a route for that agent in our instance to talk to S3. And then that's actually the biggest change. The only other one is I create an S3 bucket for us to use with some standardized naming. Once we launch that template, we'll go in, we'll turn on the logging in Session Manager. Then we need to adjust our IAM policy that we attach to the instances. If you remember, it's called SSM client, so that that is able to save down in S3, because right now it doesn't have any permission to access that bucket. And when all that's done, we're going to make a connection, we're going to test it, and then we're going to look at our logs. All right, let's go ahead and jump in. As we've been doing with most of our labs when we've been playing with networks and workloads, let's go to test account 1 and administrator access. Then we want to go to CloudFormation where we have to launch, and it's there on my pick list. As I mentioned, this is basically the exact same template that we used last time. Okay, CloudFormation is up and running, so we're going to go to Create Stack, and then I want you to paste in the link from the blog post. Give me a second. I don't have that on my clipboard. I'll go grab it. Okay, I've got the S3 bucket, or sorry, the S3 bucket. I have the template in there, and let's call it S.L.A.W. Someday I'll come up with something more creative. Feel free to send me your ideas over email. Scroll all the way down, and look, you've done this probably nearly a dozen times at this point. Click that little blue box, and then click Submit. Now, I'd love to be able to make all the other changes that we've got, but we do need to wait for this to finish. So I will pause while this runs. It should take about 3-ish minutes. The stack is now completely created. And so the first thing I want to do is let's go to the session manager, well, systems manager for the service. And we're going to turn on the logging. Scroll down on the left side, go into session manager. And this is just like what we did in our last lab if you've been following these in order. Click on preferences and then click edit. And we're going to turn on CloudWatch logging, S3 logging. Click enable and leave this setting to only allow encrypted S3 buckets. Amazon actually encrypts all S3 buckets by default with a default key, so we're all protected there. Then on this list, choose Session Manager Logs, and it will be followed with your account ID. That was just a nifty little trick that we can use within our CloudFormation template. That should be unique. If you do hit any errors, might mean somebody else actually made that random one for you. Then we don't need to make any other changes. The S3 key prefix would be if you wanted these to go into a specific directory, but we are dedicating that entire bucket to holding these logs. Click Save. That's all done. The next thing we need to do is go into IAM. Now we need to set the actual permissions so that we can access that S3 bucket. So go to Roles, and the SSM client, which is the one that we previously used. This time, instead of using a manage policy, we're going to use an inline policy because this is a policy we're only going to need this one time. So click add permission and then create inline policy. As usual, I want you to go over to click JSON. Now I'm going to temporarily pause while I go snag that policy out of the blog post, and that's where you can access it. Okay, I've got the policy. Let's paste it in. And there's one change we need to make. You'll notice we've got that error, so we can't miss it. I'll zoom in a little bit. And it wants our S3ARN in order to work. So I'll go back over to my S3 tab, copy the bucket ARN again. You can tell that I already did that once. And then paste it in. And this is super important. You need to leave the slash and you need to leave that asterisk. So let me paste it. And it needs to look just like this. Except, of course, you're going to have your own ARN associated with it. Okay, let me zoom out, scroll down. Now, because we're encrypted, you also need to be able to get the encryption configuration. We don't have to give access to any keys because we're using the default key associated with our account. Let's go next, and let's call it SSM logs. Give it a nice little name there, and create policy. Okay. If everything worked correctly, we should be able to connect. Let's go to Services, EC2, and then we'll go to Instances, and we'll pick the first one. Remember, it's just the same template as last week with the S3 bucket and that S3 service endpoint added. Go to Session Manager, click Connect. Give it a second, and we have our command line. Now, we're here to do some logging, so you can type in some commands like ls to list everything out, or oops, I don't know Linux. And let me see if I can break out of that. Let's go Control X or exit. That's funny. Whoops. What I got myself into, a little bit of a mess there. So it's actually, I will figure out later what that did on the Linux side. Okay, we're all done. And I'm going to go ahead and terminate the session. And terminate. Okay, next thing we want to do is go back to our S3 bucket. So you can see the bucket here. I'm going to click on objects, and we don't have any yet. And then I hit refresh, and I now have my first object, and it actually tells me that it's a log. So if I click on this, let's see what I can see. Object overview, and you can see that I've got my log file there. And I'm trying this part live. I'm going to open that link in a new tab, and let's see if it displays. Nope, it's going to give me an access denied because of how I'm trying to get to it through my browser. Object here. Now, why does that happen? I don't have permission and I don't have the actual key to go ahead. But trust me, the logs are there. And let's see if download will work. Yep. So I actually downloaded that log file. I'm going to pause and pull it up so we can look at it. And as you can see, let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Nope, that's because this is actually running the console to look at the logs. But you can see that I've got my little oops command not found. I don't know Linux, and everything I tried to type is right there. Look, this stuff is really, really cool. I love the fact that we can track all of the commands. We can get our full logging. It's all done natively within AWS, and it's done in a highly secure way in encrypted log buckets. Is this going to be how you always want to configure it in a large enterprise? Nope, it's not. And we could get fancier. We could store everything in a central bucket in a security account. So I skipped over a lot of those steps just to cover the basics. But I think you can see now I am a huge fan of Session Manager. And this is why I'm not even ever going to show you, or at least, well, that's a lie. I probably will show you how to SSH in a more traditional way, but we're going to avoid that absolutely for as long as possible. This is more secure. It's pretty reliable, and it's going to give me all of my logging. Okay, let's go back in and take a look at how to clean this up. Cleanup is going to be fairly straightforward, but there is one trick, which is CloudFormation won't delete an S3 bucket if there's any objects in that bucket. So click on Buckets, Click on that radio tab next to Session Manager and make sure that our session is closed. If you're logged in, it's just going to keep creating new stuff. And then I want you to click this button, Empty, to empty the bucket. This is going to delete all of the objects in there and permanently delete. Once I type that in here, it's going to allow me to empty. Now, this can take a long time. This is just running a script on the back end, basically, but this goes pretty quickly because we only had that one object in our bucket. So we have to clear that out. The next thing we need to do is go into IAM, and we want to remove our inline policy. And we're going to go to Roles, SSM Client, and we're going to remove that extra policy. What I'm doing is I'm backing out of any changes I made outside of CloudFormation, and we'll remove it. We have to type in the name, SSM Logs. Click Delete. And once that's done, I go back over to CloudFormation, click on my little tab there, and then click Delete. Delete the stack permanently, and we're all finished, and have a great week.